Thomas Crow turned the key in the lock and pushed open the door to his home in Portland's Laurelhurst neighborhood. The two-story house greeted him with the creaking of its wood floors and the scent of basil wafting from the kitchen. Large windows let in the soft light of a September evening, and an unfinished garden beyond the glass was a reminder of Avery's unfulfilled rose-planting promises. Thomas, 34, an architect with a growing reputation, dropped his briefcase by the door and unbuttoned the top button of his shirt. His dark hair was slightly disheveled from the long day, and his eyes were bright with enthusiasm for a new idea for a cultural center project. I'm home," he shouted, taking off his shoes. Avery, his wife, emerged from the kitchen, a glass of red wine in hand. She was 31, with chestnut-brown curls that fell over her shoulders and green eyes that sparkled with the same energy that had once made Thomas fall in love. She wore a white blouse and jeans, but she looked like she was getting ready for a stage performance rather than a home-cooked dinner. She smiled, but it seemed rehearsed, like she was about to go on stage. "Hello, Tom. How are you today?" she asked, taking a sip of wine. "It's fine," he replied, hanging his jacket on a hook. "The meeting with the client dragged on, but I talked them into a glass facade. It'll be a blast." He walked into the kitchen, where pasta was simmering on the stove and a bowl of salad sat on the table. Jazz was playing softly on the speakers in the living room, their usual evening ritual. Thomas reached for a bottle of water from the refrigerator, glancing at Avery. She was scrolling through her phone at the counter. "Were you at the theater today?" he asked, opening the bottle. "Yeah, rehearsal," she said, not looking up from the screen. "The final scene is still limping. The director is yelling like this is Broadway and not a local barn." Thomas chuckled as he placed the water on the table. "Well, you always say that this is your ticket to the big screen. Maybe this barn is your springboard." Avery finally put her phone down and looked at him, crossing her arms. "Very funny, Tom. I'm serious. If I give it my all, maybe an agent will notice. There are scouts in Portland, too." "I believe you," he said, sincerely but with a hint of weariness. "You're talented. Just remember to rest, okay?" She rolled her eyes but smiled. "Rest. That's for those who are already at the top, and I'm still down below, climbing." Thomas nodded, sitting down at the table. He was used to her ambitions, her dreams of Hollywood, the way she lit up when she talked about acting. When they had met at a party 3 years ago, her energy had been a magnet. She would talk about the theater, about the roles she wanted to play, and he couldn't look away. Now, 3 years into their marriage, he still admired her, but sometimes he felt like she was somewhere else. "What's new with you?" Avery asked, setting down plates of pasta. "Besides your glass fronts." "It's the same old thing," he replied, twirling spaghetti on his fork. "The center project is moving forward. If everything works out, it will be my best work. Maybe we'll even get into the magazines." "Cool," she said, but her voice was distracted. She picked up her phone again, checking her notifications. Thomas took a bite of bread, watching her. He wanted to talk about something more than work or the theater. In recent months, he had been thinking more and more about the future, about children, about how their home could become a real family nest. He cleared his throat, deciding to give it a try. "Listen, Ave," he began, "I've been thinking. Maybe we should start planning something big. You know, like a nursery or—" Avery froze, her fork halfway to her mouth. She looked at him, and for a second something flickered in her eyes, not joy, not irritation, but something elusive. She smiled quickly, but it was a strained smile. "Children's?" she asked, putting her fork down on her plate. "Tom, let's not rush this, okay? I have a show in 2 weeks. I'm all about it. Maybe we can figure it out later." "Well, I'm not saying tomorrow," he said, trying to keep his tone light. "Just a thought. We were talking about Emma or Liam, remember?" "I remember," she replied, looking away. "But now is not the time. I'm really up to my ears at work." Thomas nodded, feeling a slight pang of annoyance stir in his chest. He didn't want to push, but her answers were always like that, evasive, as if she were keeping him at a distance. He took a sip of water, pushing the feeling away. "Okay, no problem," he said. "I just thought it would be cool." Avery smiled wider, but her eyes had already returned to the phone. "It'll be cool, Tom. Just let me finish this show, okay?" She stood up, took the glass, and headed into the living room. "I'll go watch the recording of my old role. I need to remember how to pause in a monologue." Thomas watched her go, her steps light, almost dancing. He began to clear away the dishes, stacking them in the sink. The jazz on the speakers grew louder. Avery must have turned it up. He heard her humming and smiled for a second. Maybe she was right, he thought. Maybe now really wasn't the time. But as he washed the dishes, a strange feeling lingered in his chest. Not pain, not hurt, but a kind of premonition he couldn't explain. He dried his hands on a towel and walked into the living room. Avery was sitting on the couch, footage of her old play flashing on the TV screen in front of her. She was wearing a long dress, her voice confident, filling the stage. Thomas paused in the doorway, looking at her. She didn't turn around, completely absorbed in the video. He started to say something, but decided against it. "I'm going to the office to work a little," he said. "Yeah, okay," she replied, without looking up from the screen. Thomas went upstairs to his office, where the plans for the cultural center lay on his desk. He turned on the lamp, sat down at his desk, and opened his laptop. But instead of working, his gaze fell on a framed photo of them laughing in the rain, holding an umbrella. He smiled, but it quickly faded. Something was wrong, and he couldn't figure out what it was. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. Work always distracted him, and now he decided to focus on the drawings. But her words kept running through his head. "Let's take it slow." He told himself it was okay, that she was just busy. Avery had always been like this, bright, driven, living her dreams. He loved her for it. Or maybe he loved the version of her he'd seen 3 years ago. A new tune began playing downstairs, something from an old musical Avery loved. Thomas sighed, opened the project file, and began looking through the sketches. But every time he tried to focus, her evasive answers, her eyes that seemed to look past him, kept popping into his head. He put the mouse down and stood up, going to the window. The garden was dark outside, the glass, empty, with bare flower beds that Avery had promised to plant with flowers. He remembered how they had chosen this house, how she had admired the large windows, how she had said that this would be their perfect life. He had believed every word she said. Thomas returned to his desk, but his work was not going well. He picked up his phone to text his friend Sam, but decided against it. Instead, he opened his notes and began writing a list of things to do for tomorrow: meetings, calls, drawings. That always helped him feel in control. But at the bottom of the list, he wrote, without knowing why, "Talk to Avery about the kids. Seriously." He looked at the words, then closed the notes. Below, Avery laughed, apparently amused by something in the entry. Thomas shook his head, trying to push away the worry. She was just busy, he told himself. Everything would be fine. He returned to the drawings, but the feeling did not go away. Thomas closed his laptop, turned off the lamp, and went downstairs. Avery was still sitting on the couch, her eyes glued to the screen. He paused in the doorway, looking at her. "Good night, Ave," he said quietly. "Yet night," she answered without turning around. He went up to the bedroom, lay down on his bed, and stared at the ceiling. He couldn't sleep. He thought about her smile, about her words, about how she went to watch her tape. And somewhere deep inside, in the quietest corner, he felt that something was wrong. Thomas Crow parked his gray sedan next door because their Laurelhurst street was clogged with cars. Some neighbor had apparently thrown a party. It was drizzling, coating the asphalt in a thin film, and Thomas, a 34-year-old architect, pulled the hood of his jacket up as he walked to the back door of his house. His client meeting had ended earlier than he expected, and he had decided to skip the office and head straight home. Maybe he could catch Avery before her evening rehearsal, he thought, imagining them having coffee like old times. He turned the key in the lock of the back door that led into the hallway off the kitchen. The house greeted him with a cold lamplight and the smell of burnt coffee coming from the kitchen. Thomas shook the rain off his jacket and was about to shout that he was home when he heard voices, sharp, angry, not at all like their usual evenings. "You're lying to him, Avery." Avery's sister Lauren's voice was like a whiplash. "I saw your pills in your purse when I was looking for the key. You promised him kids, and you're swallowing them." Thomas froze, his hand still on the doorknob. Lauren, 28, a nurse with short hair and a blunt personality, was home for the weekend. He knew she and Avery argued often, but this was different. His heart pounded, but he stayed still, listening. "What do you even know?" Avery snapped, her voice shaking with anger. "I don't want kids, Lauren, and I'm not going to have any." "Are you serious?" Lauren almost screamed. "Thomas thinks you're planning a family, and you're lying to him." Thomas felt the blood drain from his face. He stood in the dark hallway, pressed against the wall, afraid to breathe. Avery had promised him a family. They had talked about it dozens of times, how they would push the stroller in the park, how he would build a swing in the garden. She always smiled, nodding when he dreamed out loud. His fingers tightened on the keys in his pocket. "Cheating?" Avery laughed, but it was harsh, almost hysterical. "Lauren, I married him because he's my ticket to Hollywood. His connections, his money, his name, it's my chance. You think I'm going to stay in Portland, pushing a stroller and wiping snot? I want to be a star, and he's my door to it." Thomas closed his eyes, his throat tightening. Every word was a blow. He remembered their wedding, Avery in her white dress, her laughter in the rain, her promises to love him forever. He remembered her sitting with him at dinner, nodding as he talked about children. It had all been a lie. She hadn't loved him. She had used him. "You're sick," Lauren said, her voice quieter but still full of disgust. "He loves you, Ave. He's building a life for you, and you're just lying to his face." "Oh, don't start," Avery snapped. "You've always been so proper, haven't you? Miss Conscience. And I'm doing what I have to do to get out of this mess. And if that means playing the wife, I'll do it." "You're not just playing," Lauren almost whispered. "You're ruining his life. He deserves the truth." "Really?" Avery snorted. "The truth is, I'm not going to sacrifice my dream for his diaper fantasies. He's useful, Lauren. His friend, that producer, what's his name? Mark. He promised to set me up with an agent. This is my chance. And kids, maybe later, or never." Thomas felt his legs go weak. He leaned against the wall to steady himself. His mind clung to memories, Avery hugging him after work, laughing at silly movies, her promising they would be together forever. It had all been an act. She hadn't seen him as a husband, but as a tool. "You're disgusting," Lauren said. "I can't watch this. He'll know, Ave. I'll tell him myself if you don't." "You try," Avery hissed. "And I'll cut you out of my life, okay? It's my business, not yours." Thomas heard a chair creak as someone stood up. He knew they might come out and see him. His heart was pounding so loudly he thought they would hear. He wanted to rush in, to scream, to demand an explanation, but something inside stopped him. He didn't want a scene. He didn't want to see her face, her false smile, her excuses. He wanted to leave. He slowly backed away, tiptoeing to the back door. The rain had picked up, pounding the roof. Thomas opened the door, trying not to make a sound, and slipped out. The cold air hit his face, but he barely noticed. He walked to the car, got behind the wheel, and slammed the door. His hands shook as he inserted the key into the ignition. He sat looking out at the house through the rain-clouded windshield. The kitchen light was on, and he could see the silhouettes of Avery and Lauren, still arguing. His house, his life, his marriage, everything he had spent 3 years building was a fake. Avery didn't love him. She never had. She wanted his connection, his money, his name. And he was blind, believing in her smiles, in her words, in their future. "It was all a lie," he whispered, his voice breaking. He gripped the steering wheel, trying to breathe. His chest tightened, but there were no tears, only emptiness, cold and heavy. He didn't know what to do next, but he knew one thing. He was not going back to this house. Not today, maybe never. Thomas Crow sat in his car, parked a few blocks from his home in Laurelhurst. Rain pounded the windshield, the wipers squealed, and the headlights lit up the wet pavement. His fingers were still wrapped around his keys, digging into his palm, but he didn't notice the pain. Avery's words from just a half hour ago kept playing in his head. I married him because he's my ticket to Hollywood. His connections, his money, his name, it's my chance. Each word was a blow, and now, sitting in the silent car, Thomas felt his world crumbling. He looked at the house through the rain, the kitchen lights still on, Avery and Lauren moving behind the curtains. His house, his marriage, his life, everything he had spent 3 years building was a fake. Avery didn't love him. She saw him as a tool, not a husband. Thomas closed his eyes, trying to breathe evenly, but his chest tightened as if someone had squeezed the air out of him. He didn't know how long he sat there. 5 minutes, 10. The rain continued, and Thomas realized he couldn't just sit there. He needed to move, to think, to do something. He started the engine and drove, not knowing where he was going. The streets of Portland were empty, the street lights reflecting in the puddles. He passed coffee shops closed for the night and the park where he and Avery had once walked. Finally, he stopped in front of his architecture firm in the Pearl District, its glass facade glinting dully in the rain. Thomas parked, grabbed his briefcase, and ran to the entrance, using his jacket to cover himself. He inserted the key into the lock, walked into the dark hall, and took the elevator to the third floor, where his office was. The door to his office creaked, and he turned on his desk lamp, which illuminated a table covered with blueprints for the cultural center. Models of balsa buildings stood on shelves, and sketches of his projects hung on the wall. The silence of the office was broken only by the ticking of a clock and the distant sound of rain outside the window. Thomas dropped his briefcase on the floor and collapsed into a chair, rubbing his face with his hands. His gaze fell on the blueprints, his pride, his work, his life. But now even they seemed foreign. He remembered Avery coming here, bringing him coffee, praising his talent. He thought she was proud of him. She was just playing a part, waiting for his connections to open the door to Hollywood. Thomas clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. He remembered their wedding, the park in Portland, the rain, her white dress, her words, "We'll be happy, Tom." He remembered choosing names for their future children, Emma for a girl, Liam for a boy. He made plans, and she took pills to make sure they never came to fruition. "How could I be so blind?" he muttered, his voice hoarse. He pulled out his phone, his fingers shaking as he scrolled through the contacts. He needed someone to bring him to his senses, someone who knew how to handle a crisis. Dan Wilson, a lawyer and friend since college, was that kind of person. With his quick jokes and pragmatic outlook on life, Dan had always been an anchor for the dreamy Thomas. He pressed call, praying Dan was awake. "Crow, why are you out so late?" Dan's voice was sleepy but cheerful. "Are you drawing plans until the morning again?" Thomas swallowed, his throat feeling like sandpaper. "Dan, I need help," he said, his voice breaking. "This isn't about work. This is Avery." "Avery?" Dan immediately became serious. "What happened? Did you have a fight?" "Worse," Thomas shook his head. "I heard her talking to Lauren. She's taking pills to keep from getting pregnant. She doesn't want kids, Dan. She never did. She married me for my connections, for my money. I'm just a stepping stone to Hollywood for her." "Damn," Dan whistled. "Are you serious? Did you hear that yourself?" "Every word," Thomas said, his voice firmer. "She said she wasn't going to waste her life in diapers, that I was her chance at a career. I thought she loved me, but she was just playing." "Damn, Tom, that's shit," Dan said. "I'm sorry, man. What do you want to do?" "A divorce," Thomas blurted out. "I need a divorce. Right now." "Divorce?" Dan asked. "Are you sure? Maybe I should talk to her. Find out what's what." "No," Thomas snapped. "I don't want her lies. I don't want a scene. I just want this to be over. Can you do that?" "I can," Dan said, his voice becoming businesslike. "In Oregon, divorces without kids are quick. Give me a few days, I'll get the paperwork done. But Tom, are you sure you don't want to cool off? This isn't a small thing." "I've cooled down," Thomas said, his voice cold. I believed in her love for 3 years, and she used me. I don't want to be her pawn anymore. Okay, Dan sighed. I'll take care of it. Where are you now? At home? No, Thomas replied. In the office. I left home. I don't want to see her. In the office? At midnight? Dan chuckled. Okay, architect, that's your style. Look, if anything happens, come over to my place. The couch is free. And, Tom, hang in there. This is shit, but you can handle it. Thank you, Thomas said, his voice softening. I'll call tomorrow. He hung up and put the phone down on the table. His hands were still shaking, but his decision was made. He would not go back to Avery. He would not listen to her excuses, her tears, her theatrics. He wanted freedom, and he would take it himself. Thomas stood up and walked over to the closet in the corner of his office where he kept extra clothes and gear for long work nights. He pulled out a black duffel bag and began to stuff it with the essentials: his laptop, his charger, a few shirts, a pair of jeans. He didn't look at the shelf where the photo of him and Avery from their trip to Seattle sat standing by the Space Needle laughing. He didn't want anything that reminded him of her. He walked back to his desk, his eyes falling on the plans for the cultural center. This was his job, his passion, his life. But even that felt empty now. He remembered Avery praising his designs, telling him he was talented. It had all been part of her game. Thomas's jaw tightened, his fingers brushing his wedding band, the simple gold one Avery had chosen for its style. He took it off, turning it over in his hand, remembering how she'd slipped it on his finger in front of the guests. His stomach twisted, but he set the ring down on the desk, next to an upside-down frame of their wedding photo he'd noticed on the shelf. This is the end, he said out loud, his voice quiet but firm. Thomas slung his bag over his shoulder, turned off the lamp, and walked out of the office. Elevator lowered him into the hall, and he stepped out into the rain, not caring that his jacket was soaked. He pulled out onto the road, headlights illuminating the wet asphalt, and drove into the night, into the cold rain, leaving behind everything he had once considered his. His fingers still felt empty where the ring had been, but that emptiness was not pain, but the first step toward freedom. Thomas Crow spent the night in a cheap motel on the outskirts of Portland, a few miles from his office. After his conversation with Dan, he couldn't bring himself to go to his friend's place. He didn't want questions, pity, or even support. Instead, he chose a motel with a neon sign that blinked half the letters and a room that smelled of damp and cheap detergent. The bed creaked and the sheets were thin, but he barely slept, lying on his back and staring at the ceiling. Avery's words, "He's my ticket to Hollywood," played in his head like a broken record. He tossed and turned, trying to turn off the thoughts, but by morning there were dark circles under his eyes and the same emptiness in his chest. At dawn, Thomas showered, put on yesterday's slightly wrinkled shirt, and drank vile coffee from the machine in the hotel lobby. He knew he had to go home not to make up, but to end it. The divorce he'd talked about with Dan hadn't been an impulse. It was the only thing that made sense. He got into his car, threw his bag in the back seat, and drove back to Laurelhurst. The rain had stopped, but the sky was gray, as if the town shared his mood. The smell of toast hit him as he walked into the house through the back door. Avery was in the kitchen, standing at the stove in a blue robe, her brown hair pulled back into a messy bun. She turned when she saw him, and her face lit up for a second with surprise and relief. "Tom, where have you been?" she cried, stepping towards him. "I called you half the night. You didn't answer. I thought something had happened." Thomas set his bag down by the door and looked at her. Her green eyes were wide, but he saw in them not genuine concern, but something rehearsed, like in her theatrical scenes. He took a deep breath, trying to keep his voice even. "I spent the night at a motel," he said, taking off his jacket. "After work, I went to a bar with Sam, had a few too many drinks. Didn't want to drive." It was a lie, and he knew it sounded lame, but he didn't care. He didn't want to explain that he'd heard her talking to Lauren, that her words had torn his life apart. Not now, not like this. Avery frowned, crossing her arms. "At the bar? With Sam?" she asked, her voice sharper. And you couldn't answer the phone? I was up half the night, Tom. Sorry, he said, not looking her in the eye. My phone died. She opened her mouth to object, but then waved her hand. Okay, forget it. The main thing is that you're here. Do you want some toast? I'm making it right now. No, Thomas said, his voice colder than he expected. We need to talk. Avery froze, her hand hovering over the pan with the spatula still clenched. She turned slowly, her face wary. Talk? About what? Thomas walked to the table, sat down, and pointed to the chair opposite. Sit down, Avery. She reluctantly turned off the stove, put down the spatula, and sat down, looking at him with slight irritation. What's with that tone, Tom? What happened? He looked her straight in the eye, and for a second he wanted to scream, to spill it all her lies, her pills, her words about Hollywood. But he held back. He didn't want a scene, he didn't want her tears or manipulation. He wanted to end it. I want a divorce, he said, his voice hard as stone. Avery paled, her eyes widening. What? She breathed. Divorce? Are you serious? This is because you spent the night somewhere. Tom, this is crazy. This isn't crazy, he said, not looking away. I heard you yesterday. Your conversation with Lauren. You said you didn't want kids, that you married me for my connections, for my money, that I was your ticket to Hollywood. I heard every word, Avery. Her face froze, her lips trembled. She opened her mouth, but found no words. Then her eyes darted around, and she jumped up from her chair. It's Lauren, she blurted out. She lied. I was angry. I didn't mean it. Tom, you know how we argue. She's driven me crazy. That's enough, he snapped, his voice growing louder. Don't lie to me. I heard you. You said I was useful, that your dream was more important than our family. You used me, Avery. I wasn't your husband. I was your stepping stone. No, no, no. She took a step towards him, her hands shaking. Tom, you got it all wrong. I love you. I was upset. I said stupid things. You can't ruin everything because of this. I'm not the one ruining it, he said, standing up. You did. I wanted a family, Avery. I wanted kids, a home, a life with you. And you wanted my name and my friends. I'm done being your stepping stone. Her eyes filled with tears, but Thomas could see her trying to compose herself, searching for words to turn this to her advantage. She grabbed his hand, her fingers cold. Tom, please, her voice softened, almost pleading. Let's talk. We can fix this. I don't want to lose you. He looked at her hand, then into her eyes. For a second, he remembered how he loved her laughter, her energy, her promises. But now he saw only lies. You've already lost me, he said, pulling his hand free. I heard you, Avery. You wanted my life, not me. I'm filing for divorce. Dan's already preparing the papers. She gasped, stepping back as if he had hit her. Dan, have you talked to a lawyer yet? Her voice broke. You didn't even give me a chance to explain. I don't need your explanations, he said, heading for the door. I know the truth. Tom, wait, she cried, running after him. You can't just leave. We've been together for 3 years. This is our home, our life. He stopped at the door, turned and looked at her. Her face was wet with tears, but he felt no pity, only weariness. It was your performance, he said quietly, and I'm no longer a spectator. He picked up the bag he'd left by the door and walked out. Avery called after him, but he didn't turn around. The rain had started again, a fine, cold rain, but Thomas didn't notice. He got into his car, started the engine, and drove away, leaving the house in Laurelhurst behind. The divorce was quick, as Dan had promised. In Oregon, if there are no children and no property disputes, it takes less than a month. Thomas didn't fight for the house, he left it to Avery, along with some of their savings. He didn't care. He didn't want anything that reminded him of her. Avery called almost every day, leaving voicemails, some tearful, some angry. Tom, you're making a mistake. How can you be so cruel? I'll explain everything. Give me a chance. He didn't answer. After a week of calling, he blocked her number. Thomas rented an apartment in the Pearl neighborhood minimalist, with white walls, large windows, and a view of the Willamette River. There was little furniture, a bed, a couch, a table, a few boxes of stuff. He brought only clothes, a laptop, and a few books. No photos, no souvenirs. He wanted to start from scratch. He spent his first night in the apartment unpacking boxes. The smell of cardboard mixed with the dampness of the river that wafted through the half-open window. He turned on the radio, but the music was irritating, so he turned it off. The silence was better. Thomas sat on the couch, looking out at the river, where the lights of the city were reflected in the water. His fingers touched his left hand, where the ring had been yesterday. The emptiness on his finger felt foreign, but right. He thought about how quickly everything had changed. Just yesterday, he had been a husband, making plans, believing in a family. Now he was alone, in an empty apartment, with a future that was frightening in its uncertainty. He felt his eyes sting, and for the first time that day, he allowed himself to cry. The tears were quiet, almost imperceptible, but they brought relief. He wiped his face with his sleeve, deeply took a breath, and whispered, "I can handle it." He stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the river. Somewhere out there in Laurelhurst, Avery was probably still crying or angry. But that wasn't his concern anymore. He'd made a choice. Thomas Crow woke up in his new apartment in Portland's Pearl neighborhood to the sound of his phone's alarm. It was 6 in the morning, and the gray light of a fall morning filtered through the large windows overlooking the Willamette River. The bed was hard, unused, and the room smelled of paint and cardboard from unpacked boxes. He rubbed his eyes, his head heavy from another night of fitful sleep. It had been a month since he'd left Avery, and each day felt like a treadmill of work, home, silence. Thomas stood up, made coffee in a small coffee maker, and drank it standing by the window. The river flowed calmly, reflecting the gray sky and the lights of the Hawthorne Bridge. He dressed a navy shirt, jeans, and shoes and drove to the office, past the wet streets of Portland, where maple leaves stuck to the asphalt. The smell of coffee from the cafe across the street from his business, with a sign that said Bean and Brew, hung in the air, mixing with the dampness. In a third-floor office with picture windows, Thomas immersed himself in the Cultural Center project. His desk was covered in blueprints, his computer screen glowing with a 3D model of the building, a glass facade, open spaces, a concert stage. This was his chance to make a name for himself as an architect, and he clung to the project like a life preserver. He was the first one in, the last one out, checking every corner, every line. The work drowned out thoughts of Avery, of her voice, of her words. "He's my ticket to Hollywood." "Hey, Tom, are you buried in your blueprints again?" Sam Clark, his colleague, poked his head into the office, holding a mug of coffee. Sam was in his late 30s, a good-natured father of two, with a touch of gray hair and a penchant for wearing plaid shirts. "Seriously, dude, do you live here?" Thomas looked up from the screen, forcing a smile. "I just want to finish it," he said, taking a sip from his mug. "The deadline is approaching." "Deadline's in 3 months," Sam raised an eyebrow. "You've already done more than you need to. Want to grab a beer tonight? Hopworks just got a new IPA. My boys are bugging me at home. I need a break." Thomas shook his head, looking at the screen. "No, Sam, thanks. Lots to do. Maybe another time." Sam sighed, leaning against the doorframe. "Look, Tom, I'm not trying to butt in, but I don't know, it's like you've switched off. After you and Avery, we're worried. Me, the guys on the team, you've been walking around like a ghost." Thomas tensed, his fingers hovering over the mouse. He hadn't shared the details of the divorce at the office they had just split up. But Sam was observant, and his words were spot on. "I'm fine," Thomas said, his voice even but strained. "I just need to focus on my work. Everything's fine." "Normal, you say?" Sam chuckled. "Okay, I won't push, but the offer still stands. If you change your mind, right?" "Yeah, thanks," Thomas nodded, returning to the drawings. Sam stood there for a second, then walked away, leaving Thomas alone. He stared at the screen, but the lines of code and the lines of the building were blurring. Sam was right, he was out. He avoided his friends, turned down dinner invitations, and didn't answer calls from old pals. Even Dan, who had helped with the divorce, invited him to a football game, but Thomas brushed him off. It was easier for him to be alone. At home, he spent his evenings with books rereading The Catcher in the Rye or watching old movies like Casablanca on the small TV. But even that didn't fill the void. Meanwhile, Avery, back at their Laurelhurst home, tried to move on. She auditioned at local theaters and studios, but without Thomas's name on her resume, no one noticed. His connections, the producers, the agents he'd once introduced her to at parties, no longer returned her calls. She recorded a casting video for a series, but was rejected after 2 days. Avery began attending parties in downtown Portland, at bars like the Doug Fir Lounge, where local filmmakers hung out. She wore her best dresses, flirted with producers, laughed louder than necessary, but her hopes were dashed. One guy who identified himself as an agent promised a meeting with a director, but after dinner he disappeared without returning her texts. One night, Lauren, her sister, called. Avery was sitting in the living room, scrolling through Instagram, where her party posts were racking up dozens of likes, but yielding nothing of substance. She answered, reluctantly. "Ave, how are you?" Lauren's voice was cautious but warm. "We haven't spoken in a while." "Fine," Avery muttered, pouring herself some wine. "Busy. Auditions, parties, that kind of thing." "Auditions?" Lauren asked. "And how were they going?" "They're coming," Avery lied, her voice sharpening. "There's a role coming soon, I can feel it." Lauren was silent for a moment, then said, "Eve, I'm worried about you. After what happened with Thomas, maybe you should stop? Think. You're driving yourself crazy." Avery clutched her glass, her nails turning white. "Stop?" She almost screamed. "Lauren, are you serious? This is my life, my dream. I'm not going to sit in this house and whine like you want. I don't want you to whine," Lauren said, her voice firmer. "I want you to be honest. With yourself, with Thomas. You hurt him, Ave. And now you're hurting yourself." "Oh, don't start," Avery snapped. "You were always so proper, weren't you? I didn't ask for your lectures. If you want to help, find me an agent instead of preaching." "Ave, I'm trying to." Lauren began, but Avery hung up. She threw her phone on the couch, finished her wine, and turned on the TV, where an old episode of Friends was playing. But her eyes were empty. She didn't want to think about Lauren, about Thomas, about her failures. She wanted to believe that the next casting call, the next party, the next man would open the door to Hollywood for her. But somewhere deep down, she knew that door was closed. Thomas, meanwhile, was staying late at the office. It was after 9, the office empty except for the cleaning lady rattling a bucket in the hallway. He was sitting at his desk, bent over drawing a sketch of the square in front of the cultural center. His pencil moved on its own, adding details, benches, trees, swings. He froze when he realized that he had drawn a playground, the kind he had planned for the children he would never have with Avery. His throat tightened. "Damn," he muttered, crumpling the sheet. He dropped the paper into the wastebasket, turned off the lamp, and stood up. Light from the street lamps filtered through the picture windows, illuminating the wet streets of Portland. Thomas looked out at the city, at the cafe across the street with its sign lit, and felt loneliness wash over him. Thomas Crow straightened his tie as he stood outside a banquet hall in downtown Portland. A benefit for his architecture firm was in full swing. Live music, a jazz quartet with a saxophone filled the warm room, and the scent of pine from the tree decorations mingled with the wine and hors d'oeuvres. The lights reflected off the tall windows, which looked out onto the damp streets of Portland in autumn. Thomas, in a dark gray suit, felt out of place. He'd only come because Sam, his coworker, had insisted. "Tom, stop hiding in the office. Show your face, shake hands, and get free wine." Thomas took a glass of white wine from the waiter's tray and stood against the wall, watching the crowd. Men in suits discussed business. Women in cocktail dresses laughed, jingling their bracelets. His firm was raising money for a local homeless shelter, and the room was full of familiar faces, clients, partners, a few city officials. Thomas nodded when someone said hello, but he didn't linger to talk. 2 months after his divorce, he still avoided unnecessary socializing, preferring work and solitude. Thomas Crow himself. Sam clapped him on the shoulder, beer in hand. His plaid shirt looked out of place among the suits, but Sam didn't care. "I thought you'd be gone in 5 minutes." "It's not too late," Thomas muttered, but the corners of his lips twitched into a smile. "Nah, dude, you're staying," Sam said, looking around the room. "The mayor's over there. Talk to him about your center. And by the way, I brought someone you'll like. She's a teacher, works with my boys at school. Claire Hayes. She's a great girl, no nonsense." Thomas rolled his eyes. "Sam, I'm not in the mood for dating." "No, not a date, just a chat," Sam winked. "She's at the bar, in a blue dress. Come on, I'll introduce her." "No," Thomas snapped, but Sam was already tugging at his elbow. They made their way through the crowd to the bar, where a woman in her mid-30s stood with a warm smile and her blonde hair pulled back into a messy bun. Her blue dress was simple but elegant, and she held a glass of water rather than wine. She turned when Sam called out to her. "Claire, this is Thomas, a fellow architect," Sam said, beaming. "Tom, this is Claire Hayes, the best literature teacher in Portland." "Hey," Claire said, holding out her hand, her blue-gray eyes direct and open. "Sam said you were building something cool, a center of some kind." Thomas shook her hand, feeling awkward. "Yeah, a cultural center," he said, clearing his throat. "Still in the process. And you? Study literature?" "Yeah, high school," she nodded, smiling. "Shakespeare, Hemingway, stuff like that. Trying to convince teenagers that books are cooler than TikTok." "It's probably not easy," Thomas said, his lips automatically stretching into a smile. "Oh, you have no idea," Claire laughed. Her laugh was light, genuine, without the theatrics he was used to with Avery. Sam clapped his hands. "Well, I'll leave you," he said. "I need to catch the mayor. Don't be bored." He left, winking at Thomas, who silently promised him a scolding. Claire looked after Sam, then at Thomas. "Is he always like this?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "Worse," Thomas said, sipping his wine. "But he's a good guy. He just likes to bring people together." "Yeah, I noticed," Claire chuckled. "He invited me here and said it would be fun. So far, all I see is a bunch of people in suits showing off to each other." Thomas chuckled, looking around the room. "That's a good point. I'm only here for the company and the free wine." "Honestly," Claire raised her glass of water. "I'm driving, so water is the most I can drink. But I was hoping for normal conversations, not about business or the weather." "Well, I'm not talking about business," Thomas said, relaxing. "What do you read, besides Shakespeare for school?" Claire perked up, her eyes lighting up. "Oh, I just reread The Great Gatsby. For the umpteenth time, I didn't even count. That book. It's like a mirror, you know. Everyone wants something unattainable." Thomas nodded, his interest piqued. He had read Fitzgerald in college, but hadn't returned in a long time. "Gatsby?" he asked. "The guy who did everything for one woman." "Yeah," Claire said, looking at him with a sly smile. "You look a bit like him, by the way. A rich architect, all mysterious, just hopefully without tragedy." Thomas froze, then laughed, for the first time in months, genuinely, heartily. The laughter was unexpected, and he was surprised at how easily it came. "No tragedy, I promise," he said, shaking his head. "Although the mystery is probably just because I don't like such evenings." "I understand." Claire leaned a little closer. "Me too. But Sam said it would be interesting, so I decided to take a chance. So far, I don't regret it." Thomas looked at her, feeling the tension in his chest ease a little. Claire was different, not like Avery, with her flamboyance and ambition. She was calm, open, and her words were unsubtle, unplayful. They continued talking about books, about movies, about life. Claire told him about the time her student wrote an essay about Gatsby, comparing him to a rapper, and Thomas laughed again, imagining it. He, in turn, shared a story about his first project, a college library, which almost collapsed because he miscalculated. Really? Claire's eyes widened. And you weren't kicked out? It's a miracle, Thomas said, smiling. But I've learned to check everything 3 times. She nodded, her smile warm. That's cool. Not everyone can learn from mistakes. My students, for example, think that everything will resolve itself. They chatted, not noticing how time was flying. The jazz had given way to a slow melody, and people around them were dancing or breaking up into groups. Thomas found himself not wanting the conversation to end. Claire wasn't asking about his past, not prying into his soul, but her sincerity made him feel normal. For the first time in 2 months, he wasn't thinking about Avery every minute. Listen, Claire glanced at her watch. I should probably go. I have classes tomorrow, and my 10th graders won't forgive me if I yawn. Already? Thomas was surprised at how quickly the evening had passed. Well, yeah, I get it. School's no joke. Yeah, she smiled, finishing her water. But it was great chatting. You're not that Gatsby. You're not such a daisy, he replied, and they both laughed. Claire took a napkin from the counter, took a pen from her purse, and wrote something. Then she handed it to him. Here's my number, she said, looking straight ahead. Call me if you want coffee. No suits or charity events. Thomas took the napkin, his fingers touched it, and he felt a slight warmth in his chest. Not passion, not love, but something simple, alive. Okay, he said, smiling. Maybe I'll call. I hope so, Claire winked, took her purse and headed for the exit, turning around one last time. Good night, Thomas. Night, Claire, he replied, looking after her. He stood at the bar, holding a napkin with her number on it. The room was still buzzing, the music was playing, but for Thomas, everything had become quieter. He looked at the numbers written in neat handwriting and put the napkin in his pocket. For the first time in a long time, he felt that tomorrow might not be as empty as today. Thomas Crow parked outside the Bean and Brew on Hawthorne Street in Portland, staring at the sign with the painted coffee bean. It was a Saturday in late October, and autumn leaves carpeted the sidewalk like a red and yellow carpet. The smell of wet grass and freshly brewed coffee wafted through the air as he walked toward the entrance. He'd texted Claire Hayes, the teacher from the fundraiser, the day before to ask if they could meet for coffee. Her response, cool, let's do Hawthorne at 10, was so casual that Thomas felt a little less awkward. 3 months into his divorce, he was still getting used to the idea of being able to chat with someone without pressure. The cafe was warm inside, smelling of cinnamon and baked goods. Claire was already sitting by the window, wearing jeans and a green sweater, her blonde hair down, a large mug of latte in front of her. She waved at him, smiling, and Thomas couldn't help but smile back. Hello, he said, taking off his jacket and sitting down opposite. Aren't you late? No, I'm just early, Claire said, sliding the menu over. I love this place. Their croissants are something else. Have you ordered yet? Not yet, Thomas said, looking at the menu. What do you recommend? A latte and an almond croissant, she said, taking a sip from her mug. But I'm biased, I practically live here. Thomas chuckled and called the waitress over, ordering the same thing as Claire. While they waited, she began telling them about her week. There's a kid in my class, Jacob, who wrote an essay about his dog, Claire said, her eyes lighting up. He called it Why Buddy is the Best Philosopher. Seriously, he compared the dog to Socrates because he always looks like he knows something important. I laughed while I was checking it. That's brilliant, Thomas said, smiling. He should be a writer. Yeah, that's what I told him, Claire nodded. But he wants to be a skateboarder. He says philosophy is for dogs, and he's for tricks. The waitress brought the coffee, and Claire accidentally knocked the mug over as she reached for the sugar. The coffee splashed on the table, and she gasped, grabbing the napkins. Oh, well, here I am, as usual, she laughed, wiping up the puddle. Every time I try to be cool, I spill something. That's talent, Thomas teased, helping her with the napkins. Maybe you should join the circus. Yeah, juggling cups, she replied, rolling her eyes. And you, how's your week going? Still building your center? Thomas took a sip of his coffee, feeling its lightness relax him. Yeah, he said. We had a budget dispute with the client this week. They want more glass, but they don't want to pay for it. We have to be diplomatic. Wow, Claire raised an eyebrow. If I were you, I'd just say, pay or no glass. But I'm not a diplomat, I'm a teacher. We just give out bad grades. Good approach, Thomas chuckled. Maybe I'll give it a try. They finished their coffee, and Claire suggested they take a walk in Laurelhurst Park, a few blocks away. Thomas agreed, and they walked outside, where the air was crisp and the sound of children's laughter could be heard in the distance. The park was alive with life, families walking their dogs, teenagers riding bikes, and leaves crunching underfoot. Claire shoved her hands into her jacket pockets, her cheeks pink from the cold. I love autumn, she said, kicking at a pile of leaves. Everything is so bright, but you know winter is coming. It's like nature is giving its last concert. Yeah, Thomas nodded, looking at the trees. We used to walk here on weekends. He trailed off, not wanting to mention Avery, but Claire didn't press the issue. Instead, she pointed to the pond where the ducks were swimming in circles. Look, that duckling over there, she said. He's like my student who's always late. He's swimming as if he's in no hurry. Thomas laughed, feeling the tension drain away. They walked down the path, and without expecting it, he began to tell a story. You know, when I was in college, I designed a library, he said. My first big project. I was so sure it was a masterpiece. And then it turned out I forgot to take the gutters into account, and the roof leaked on the first presentation. Seriously? Claire's eyes widened, holding back a laugh. And what did you do? He turned red as a tomato and said it was an innovative cooling system, he replied, and they both burst out laughing. Brilliant, Claire said, wiping away tears of laughter. You should have gone into marketing. They sat on a bench by the pond, and the conversation flowed naturally. Claire told him about her first job, teaching English at a small school where half the students slept in class. Thomas told him about the time he got stuck in an elevator with a client who hated his project. They joked, argued about which movie was better, Breakfast at Tiffany's or Blade Runner, and Thomas found himself smiling more than he had in months. Listen, Claire said, looking at her watch, I have to go home and get ready for school. But that was awesome. Let's do it again some other time. Yes, Thomas said, feeling a lightness he hadn't felt in a long time. I'm for it. They began meeting regularly coffee on Saturdays, walks in the park, the occasional dinner at a pizza place on Belmont Street. Thomas insisted it was just friendship, and Claire didn't press, didn't ask questions about his past. Her kindness and humor were like fresh air, and he began to find himself looking forward to these meetings, like a sip of water after a long day. One day, over coffee, Claire said, We have a play at school next week. My guys are putting on Romeo and Juliet. Do you want to come? They're trying, although Romeo sometimes forgets his lines. Thomas hesitated, but her smile was so infectious that he nodded. Okay, that sounds fun, he said. When? Friday at 7, she replied, beaming. I'll send you the school's address. Just don't laugh if the decorations fall. I promise, he said, raising his hands. On Friday, Thomas arrived at Selwood High School, where a tattered banner hung outside the door. Romeo and Juliet, 7 p.m. The room was packed with parents, students, and teachers, and the air smelled of popcorn and hairspray. Thomas sat in the 5th row, feeling a little out of place, but Claire waved at him from the wings, and he relaxed. The play was chaotic but charming. Romeo, a lanky guy in sneakers, stumbled through his monologues, Juliet sighed dramatically, and the set a cardboard balcony wobbled suspiciously. But the kids were playing with all their hearts, and the audience erupted in laughter and applause. Thomas found himself smiling at their enthusiasm. He remembered Avery's time in the theater, but her performances were always about herself, not the story. This was different, honest, imperfect, alive. When the curtain came down, or rather, when it was pulled down by two guys by hand, the audience stood up and applauded. Claire walked out on stage, wearing jeans and a black t-shirt, and hugged her students, beaming with pride. She walked down into the audience and approached Thomas, her face aglow. "Well, what do you think?" she asked, adjusting her hair. "We're not Broadway, but we tried." "Cool," Thomas said, clapping his hands. "Romeo's a star." And the balcony almost didn't fall. "Ha, that's a success," laughed Claire. She looked at the stage where her students were hugging and taking pictures. "They're great, aren't they?" Thomas nodded, looking at her. Her joy for the children, her simple, sincere smile touched something in him. For the first time in a long time, he felt not alone, but part of something alive. "It's true," he said quietly, and their eyes met for a second longer than necessary. Thomas Crow sat at a booth at Sizzle Pie on Belmont Street in Portland, watching Claire Hayes try to bite into an anchovy pizza without spilling the toppings. The cozy room was dimly lit, filled with the smell of tomato sauce and cheese and old rock something by Nirvana, perfect for a fall evening wafted over the speakers. It was a Friday in November, and his and Claire's routines, coffee, walks, now dinners, had become as familiar as breathing. They still called it friendship, but Thomas felt like her presence filled the void left by his divorce from Avery. "No, seriously, who orders anchovies?" Thomas said, cutting into his pepperoni pizza. "It's like voluntarily eating fish out of a can." Claire rolled her eyes, wiping the corner of her mouth with a napkin. "It's called taste, Tom," she replied, her blue-gray eyes sparkling. "Not everyone likes boring pepperoni." "Boring?" He raised an eyebrow, feigning indignation. "It's a classic. You just don't understand the genius of simplicity." "Oh, come on," Claire laughed, taking a sip of her cola. "You're an architect who builds glass palaces. Where's the simplicity in that?" Thomas chuckled, leaning back in his chair. He loved these exchanges, easy, unsubtle, and with Claire, everything came naturally. She didn't demand that he be someone else, didn't expect big words or gestures. In recent weeks, he'd told her about his job, about how he'd almost failed a college project, even about his habit of watching old movies when he couldn't sleep. But he'd kept quiet about the divorce, and she hadn't pressed him, even though he knew that Sam, their mutual friend, had probably spilled the beans. His phone vibrated on the table, and Thomas glanced at the screen. A message from an unfamiliar number. He frowned, opened it, and his stomach dropped. It was Avery. He'd blocked her old number a month ago, but it seemed she'd found a new way to get through to him. The message was long, and he skimmed the first few lines. "Tom, I know you don't want to talk, but I have to. I'm so sorry." "Everything okay?" Claire asked, noticing how he tensed. Thomas put his phone down, face down, forcing a smile. "Yeah, just spam," he lied, but his voice was strained. Claire looked at him, but didn't press. Instead, she took another bite of pizza and said, "You know, today one of my students said that Hamlet is about a vengeful teenager with depression. I almost fell off my chair." Thomas chuckled, grateful for the change of topic. "Well, he's not entirely wrong," he said. "Hamlet would really be hanging out in a black sweatshirt if he were alive today." "Ha, right," Claire laughed. "I'd listen to Billie Eilish and tweet about how unfair the world is." They continued to chat, but Thomas's phone lay on the table like mine. He tried not to think about the text, but Avery's words were already ingrained in his brain. After dinner, when the waitress cleared away the plates and Claire ordered coffee, Thomas couldn't take it anymore. "Listen," he said, looking at his hands folded on the table. "That wasn't spam. It was from my ex-wife." Claire nodded, her face remaining calm. "Want to tell?" she asked, stirring her coffee. "I'm not intruding, but if you need to talk, I'm here." Thomas took a deep breath. He hadn't talked about Avery to anyone but Dan, and even with him it had been short sentences. But Claire had looked at him without judgment, and he suddenly realized he wanted to spill it. She wrote that she was sorry, he began, his voice quiet, that she didn't mean for it to end this way. But then, she wrote that I replaced her too quickly, that I didn't even give her a chance to explain. Claire was silent, her spoon frozen in her mug. Thomas continued, looking at the table. She found out through mutual friends that I was talking to someone, probably about you. And now she's, I don't know, angry, jealous, but her words, they're like knives. I thought I was over it, but it still hurts. He paused, feeling an old wound reopen. Avery, her voice, her promises, it all came back to him, as if the divorce had happened yesterday, not 3 months ago. He remembered her crying when he announced the divorce, trying to stop him. And now this text, full of apologies and accusations. You replaced me so quickly. How could you? Claire put down her spoon and looked at him. Tom, can I say something? Her voice was soft but firm. Yes, he nodded, meeting her gaze. You don't have to forgive her, she said. Whatever she did, it was her choice, and her pain is hers too. But you have to move on, not to prove anything to her, but for yourself. You deserve to be happy, you know. Thomas looked at her, her words simple, but they hit the nail on the head. He felt guilty for moving on, for laughing with Claire, for not responding to Avery. But Claire saw him not as an ex-husband, not as a victim, but as a man who deserved a new life. Thank you, he said, his voice hoarse. I'm just not used to it, to someone understanding. Well, I'm a teacher, Claire smiled, her eyes warming. Understanding people is my job. Plus, you're not that complicated, Crow. Thomas laughed, and the tension in his chest eased a little. Not complicated? He asked again. Is that a compliment or an insult? A compliment, she replied, winking. But don't get cocky, or you'll start building castles instead of centers. He shook his head, smiling. The waitress brought the bill, and Thomas insisted on paying. My turn, he said. You paid for the coffee last time. Okay, but then I'll pick the next movie, Claire said, putting on her jacket. And none of your old black and white stuff. Something with action. Agreed, he replied, feeling how her lightness brought him back to the moment. They walked out of the pizzeria, the air cold but crisp, with the smell of wet asphalt. Claire stopped at her car, a small blue hatchback, and turned to face him. Good night, Tom, she said, her smile warm. And don't read that message again, okay? It's not worth it. I won't, he promised, although he knew he might still read it. Night, Claire. She got into her car, waved at him, and drove away. Thomas stood on the sidewalk, watching her headlights disappear around the corner. He pulled out his phone, looked at Avery's text, but didn't open it. Instead, he put it in his pocket and walked to his car. That night, sitting in his apartment, Thomas thought about Claire, her words, her laughter, her quiet confidence. She hadn't tried to fix him or save him, but with her, he felt alive. For the first time in a long time, he looked to the future not with anxiety, but with cautious hope. He remembered how she had laughed at his joke about the castles and smiled to himself. Maybe I can start over after all, he muttered, looking out the dark window, where the lights of the Willamette River were reflected. Thomas Crow pulled into a parking lot at the mouth of the Columbia Gorge, an hour outside of Portland. It was early Saturday morning in early December, and the crisp air smelled of pine and damp earth. The sky was clear, a rarity in Oregon in the fall, and the sun shone through the pines, casting long shadows on the gravel. Claire Hayes stood at the trailhead, tying the laces of her battered hiking boots, her blonde hair in a braid, a backpack with a thermos of tea slung over her shoulders. She had insisted on this hike, saying that Thomas needed to get out of the office and breathe life. Ready to hit the mountains? Claire asked, standing up and adjusting the straps of her backpack. Her green jacket was a little faded, but it fit perfectly. Thomas, wearing a black windbreaker and a camera around his neck, closed the trunk and grinned. Mountains? He asked again. I thought we were just going to walk to the waterfall. Multnomah isn't just a waterfall, Claire said, squinting. It's a legend. Plus, I brought mint tea, so you have to come. Okay, you win, he said, raising his hands. Lead on, oh great guide. Claire laughed and walked ahead along the gravel path. Thomas followed, breathing in the cool air. The trail to Multnomah Falls was easy but picturesque. Pine and cedar trees lined the path, moss covered the rocks, and the sound of water rising in the distance. They walked in silence for the first 10 minutes, enjoying the silence, broken only by the singing of birds and the crunch of branches underfoot. Look, Claire pointed to a squirrel scurrying across the trail with a nut in its mouth. It's clearly on its way to an important meeting. Or he's hiding his supplies from taxes, Thomas replied, and they both chuckled. Claire stopped to adjust her backpack and looked at him. Have you ever been hiking? She asked. Or are you such a city architect? I have, Thomas said, shifting the camera strap to his other shoulder. In college, I went to Yosemite with some friends. But honestly, I'm more of a city park kind of guy. You seem right at home here. Well, I grew up in the suburbs, Claire said, continuing to walk. We had woods behind our house, and I was always bringing books in there and reading under the trees. Then I started hiking to disconnect. It's like a reboot. Thomas nodded, looking at her back. He liked her simplicity. She wasn't trying to impress. She wasn't playing a role. After Avery, whose life had been one big performance, it was a breath of fresh air. They reached the observation deck at Multnomah Falls, a huge, nearly 200-meter stream of water that tumbled over a cliff, crashing onto the rocks below. The sound of the water drowned out everything. Splashes settled on their faces, and the sun's rays created a rainbow in the fog. Claire dropped her backpack and sat down on a wooden bench. Thomas sat down next to her, taking out his camera. What a view, he said, taking a photo. Worth the trek. I told you so, Claire smiled, opening the thermos and pouring tea into 2 metal mugs. Here you go. Mint, as promised. Thomas took the mug, their fingers brushing for a second, and he felt a slight warmth. The tea was hot, with a sharp minty aroma, and he sipped it, looking out at the waterfall. Cool, he said. Do you always carry a thermos on your hikes? Yeah, Claire nodded. It's tradition. My dad always took coffee on his hikes, but I chose tea. He says I betrayed the family values. Thomas laughed, shaking his head. My family is more of a backyard barbecue kind of family, he said. Hiking isn't their thing. They fell silent, looking at the waterfall. The sound of the water was soothing, and Thomas felt the tension in his shoulders ease. Claire sipped her tea, her eyes following the rainbow in the spray. You know what I dream about? She said suddenly, without taking her eyes off the water. To go to Iceland. There are such waterfalls, such landscapes. I've seen photos, and it's like another world. I want to see it with my own eyes. Iceland? Thomas asked, looking at her. Cool. Why there? I don't know, Claire shrugged. It just seems like you can feel small there, but in a good way. Like the world is bigger than your problems. What about you? What do you dream about? Thomas hesitated, his fingers tightening around his mug. Dreams? He used to dream of family, of children, of a home with Avery. Now those dreams seemed foreign, and he was afraid to build new ones. Honestly, he said, looking at the waterfall, I don't know. After the divorce, it's like I forgot how to dream. Everything I planned turned out to be a lie. Now I just live day by day. Claire looked at him, her face soft, without pity, only understanding. It's okay, she said quietly. Sometimes you just have to give yourself time. But the dreams will come back, Tom. They always do. He nodded, but an old ache stirred in his chest. He hadn't planned to open up, but her calm, the sound of the waterfall, the golden light of the sunset, it was as if his tongue had been loosened. She lied to me, he said, his voice hoarse. Avery, my ex. I thought we were starting a family. I wanted kids, a house, all that. And she married me for my career, for my connections. I wasn't her husband, I was her means. Claire was silent, her mug frozen in her hands. Thomas continued, looking at the water. I heard her say it to her sister, that I was her ticket to Hollywood, that she didn't want kids, that she was taking pills to avoid them. It was like a knife in the back. I still don't understand how I could have been so blind. He fell silent, feeling his throat tighten. He didn't look at Claire, afraid to see pity, but she simply set the mug down on the bench and said, "It's terrible, Tom. I can't even imagine what it was like for you. But you're not blind. You trusted her. It's not weakness. It means you're real." Thomas turned to her, her eyes serious but warm. He felt something inside him flutter, not pain, but relief. "Thank you," he said. I haven't told anyone about this, not even my friends, only my lawyer and only briefly." "Well, I'm glad you told me," Claire smiled, her voice soft. "Sometimes you have to talk to let go." She paused, then added, "I had a breakup too. Not like yours, but it hurt. My boyfriend of 3 years left me for another woman, said I was too ordinary, that he needed someone who was on fire like him. I cried for a month, and then I realized I didn't want to be someone else's copy. I wanted to be myself." Thomas looked at her. Her words were simple, but there was power in them. Claire didn't complain, she didn't dramatize, but her vulnerability made her closer, more real. "He was an idiot," Thomas said, and they both laughed. "Yeah, I think so too," Claire replied, sipping her tea. "But it's taught me to appreciate those who see me for who I am. And you, Tom, you deserve that too." The sunset painted the sky gold and pink, the waterfall sparkling in the last rays. Claire stood, looking out over the water, her silhouette sharp against the light. She turned to Thomas and held out her hand. "Shall we go closer?" she asked. "I want to feel the spray." He nodded, put down his mug, and took her hand. Her fingers were warm despite the cold, and he felt his fear of trust, fear of dreaming retreats. They walked to the edge of the platform, where the spray of the waterfall settled on their jackets. Claire looked at the water, her face glowing. "Sometimes you just have to take a step," she said, not letting go of his hand. "Not knowing what's going to happen, but going anyway." Thomas squeezed her fingers, feeling ready not for love, not for big plans, but for this moment, for this step. He looked at her, at the waterfall, at the golden light, and nodded. "Yes," he said quietly, "you're right." Avery Crow, now just Avery Lynn again, lugged her suitcase up the narrow stairs of her new apartment in West Hollywood, Los Angeles. The tiny third-floor studio smelled of old carpet and paint, and the only window looked out onto the bustling Sunset Strip, where neon bar signs blinked on and off at all hours. It was winter, but in Los Angeles that meant nothing more than a light jacket and sunglasses. Avery, wearing skinny jeans and a black blouse, dropped her suitcase by the bed and collapsed on the mattress, staring at the ceiling stained from an old leak. Portland, her former home with Thomas, was gone, along with their marriage, which she had spoken out of 5 months earlier. Now she was here, in the city of her dreams, set to become a star. She stood up, unpacked a few dresses and shoes, and hung them in a closet that creaked with every movement. Her phone pinged with a notification, her Instagram post, a photo of her suitcase, and the caption, "New chapter in life." Avery smiled, but it was an empty smile. She opened the fridge, found a bottle of water, and drank it, looking out the window at the city. The bright lights of the Sunset Strip beckoned, promising fame, but for now all she had was $1,000 a month rent and the hope of auditions. The next morning, Avery headed to a casting call at a studio in North Hollywood. She wore a red dress that showed off her chestnut-colored locks and applied makeup that was fresh but not overdone. Dozens of girls sat in the waiting room, flipping through scripts or chatting on the phone. Avery sat up straight, reciting her lines for a bit part on a TV show about doctors. When her name was called, she walked in with a smile, but the director, a balding man with glasses, barely glanced at her. "Name," he muttered, looking at the tablet. "Avery Lynn," she answered, her voice confident. "Okay, go ahead," he said without looking up. Avery delivered the monologue, a nurse pleading with a doctor to save a patient with all she had. She knew she was good, but the director just nodded. "Thank you, we'll get in touch," he said, already calling the next one. Avery stepped out, her smile not wavering until she got into the car. She slammed her palm on the steering wheel and cursed. In Portland, her name meant something, thanks to Thomas and his connections. Here, she was a nobody, but she wasn't going to give up. A week later, she got lucky she was cast in an episode of that very series. The role was tiny, 3 lines, a nurse in a background scene. Avery spent 6 hours on the set, in a tight suit, under blazing spotlights. She smiled, even when an assistant rudely told her to stay out of the frame. After filming, she took a photo in the dressing room, posted it on Instagram with a hashtag #actressashevitsia, and the post got 200 likes. But there were no calls from agents. Avery started going to parties, hoping for connections. At a bar called the Viper Room, she met a producer named Kevin. He was in his 40s, in a leather jacket, with an oily smile. He ordered her a martini, called her Starlet, and promised to set her up with a meeting with the director of a new Netflix series. Avery laughed at his jokes, touched his arm, sensing that this was her chance. They had dinner at a restaurant on Santa Monica Boulevard that smelled of cigarettes and expensive wine. Kevin talked about his projects, the stars he worked with, and Avery believed every word. "I'll call tomorrow, baby," he said, kissing her cheek goodbye. "That'll be your part." But he didn't call the next day, or the day after. Avery texted him, but the messages went unanswered. She sat in her apartment, staring at her phone and finishing her second bottle of wine in a week. Her social media feeds were filled with colorful photos. She's at a bar, she's on the beach, she's drinking, but behind the scenes, there was emptiness. She had no friends in LA, just acquaintances who disappeared, like Kevin. She started drinking more, not noticing how her evenings with a glass were becoming a habit. One Saturday, her sister Lauren called. Avery was lying on her bed, scrolling through Instagram, where her latest post, a selfie at a club, had garnered 300 likes, but no comments from anyone she wanted. She answered, her voice tired. "Ave, hi," Lauren said, her tone cautious. "How are you? In Los Angeles?" "Cool," Avery lied, sitting up and rubbing her eyes. "I'm busy as hell. Filming, partying, that kind of thing." "Filming?" Lauren asked. "That's cool. What kind of project is it?" "A TV series," Avery said evasively, pouring herself a glass of wine from the bottle on the nightstand. "A small role, but it's a start." Lauren was silent for a moment, then said, "Ave, I'm worried about you. You left so quickly after everything with Thomas. Maybe you should go back to Portland, at least for a while. We could talk." Avery clutched the glass, her nails digging into her palm. "Come back?" She almost screamed. "Lauren, are you serious? I didn't leave to sit in the same house and whine. I'll still be a star, okay? I just need time. I'm not saying you should whine." Lauren tried to keep her voice calm. "But you're alone in there, Ave, and after what you did to Thomas, don't you think it's time to stop, to think?" "What am I supposed to think about?" Avery snapped, her voice shaking. "About how he left me. How did you tell me it was my fault? I'm doing what I have to do, Lauren, and I don't need your advice." "Ave, I just want to help," Lauren said, but her voice was tired. "You're my sister. I don't want you to break down." "I won't break," Avery cried. "I'll become someone, and you'll regret not believing in me." She hung up, threw her phone on the bed, and finished her wine in one gulp. Her hands were shaking, but she didn't cry. She couldn't afford to be weak. She opened Instagram, posted a story of herself with a glass, with the caption, "Life in La is hot," and lay down, staring at the ceiling. The noise of the party from the bar next door drifted through the window, mixing with the smell of cigarettes from the street. Avery picked up her phone to check her likes, but her fingers opened the gallery. She scrolled through old photos: Portland, the house in Laurelhurst, her and Thomas. In one picture, they were standing in a park, his arm around her, both laughing. Her eyes filled with tears, but she gritted her teeth. It had been her mistake she had lost him, but not because of love. She had lost his connections, his support, his name. And now she was alone, in a city that ignored her. "The hell with you, Tom," she whispered, her voice breaking. She hit delete on the photo, the screen flickered, and the picture disappeared. Avery stood up, walked over to the refrigerator, and pulled out a new bottle of wine. She poured herself a cocktail, wine and soda, like she did at parties, and raised her glass, looking at her reflection in the window. The lights of Los Angeles shone through the glass, but they seemed cold, like her dreams. "I'll show everyone yet," she said out loud, ordering another cocktail in her head, where she was already a star. Thomas Crow straightened the collar of his shirt as he stood in front of the mirror in his apartment in Portland's Pearl neighborhood. It was a Friday in mid-December, and he was getting ready to have dinner with Claire Hayes at Mamma Mia, an Italian restaurant on Nob Hill. It was drizzling outside, the city lights reflected in the Willamette River, and there was a feeling growing in his chest that he could no longer ignore. It had been 6 months since his divorce from Avery, and in those months, Claire, her laughter, her kindness, her sincerity had become more than a friend to him. He was in love, and today he was going to tell her. Thomas put on his navy jacket, grabbed his umbrella, and walked out, feeling his heartbeat a little faster. The restaurant was 10 minutes away, and he parked outside an old brick building where the Mamma Mia sign glowed a warm yellow. Inside, it smelled of garlic, fresh basil, and warm bread. The soft candlelight reflected off the glasses, and an Italian guitar played softly over the speakers. Claire was already waiting at a table by the window overlooking the city, wearing a simple black dress, her blonde hair down, and her smile, as always, made him relax. "Hi," she said, standing up and hugging him. "You look like you're going to an important meeting." "Well, dinner with you is an important meeting," Thomas replied, smiling, and they sat down. The waiter brought the menu, and Claire immediately pointed to the pasta. "I'm for carbonara," she said. "And you? Don't tell me you're going to have something boring like a margarita again." "Hey, margarita's a classic," Thomas countered, feigning a frown. "But okay, I'll have the mushroom ravioli, so you don't whine." "Wow, Crow, you're taking a risk," Claire teased, her eyes sparkling. "I'm proud." They ordered food and a bottle of red wine, and the conversation flowed as easily as ever. Claire told them about her week. Her student wrote an essay about Macbeth, comparing it to a rap battle, and she was still laughing. Thomas shared how his cultural center project had been approved by the city council, and now he can start construction in the spring. "That's awesome, Tom," Claire said, raising her glass. "Here's to your center. It's going to be awesome." "Thank you," he replied, clinking glasses with her. "And to your students. They clearly take their cues from you." "Ha, if only," she chuckled, sipping her wine. "Half of them think I'm too strict, and the other half think I'm a cool teacher. I haven't decided yet who's right." Thomas looked at her, her ease, her smile, and felt the words he had been rehearsing all day bursting out. He cleared his throat, put down his glass, and looked into her eyes. "Claire, can I say something?" His voice was a little hoarse, but firm. She nodded, her smile softening. "Of course, Tom. What is it?" He took a deep breath, his fingers nervously clenching the napkin. You made me believe in myself again," he began. "After the divorce, I thought it was over. I didn't want to let anyone in, didn't want to dream, nothing. But your kindness, your laughter, the way you see the world, it all brought me back to life. And I realized that I was in love with you." Claire froze, her eyes widening but not looking away. Thomas felt his heart pounding, but he continued. "I don't expect you to say the same thing right now," he said. "But I couldn't keep quiet any longer. You're too important to me." There was a moment of silence, but it wasn't heavy. Claire smiled slowly, her cheeks turning pink, and she placed her hand on the table, closer to his. "Tom," she said, her voice soft but sincere. "I like you too. You're real, and I feel so comfortable with you, like I've never felt with anyone else. But I want us to take it slow, okay? To let it grow naturally. I don't want us to rush into things before we're ready." Thomas nodded, feeling the tension in his chest turn to warmth. Her words were honest, and he respected that. "I'm not rushing you," he said, smiling. "I just wanted you to know." "I know," Claire replied, her eyes shining. "And I'm glad you told me." The waiter brought the pasta, and they began to eat, but the conversation grew warmer, closer. Claire told him about being stuck in the school library trying to find an old book, and Thomas laughed at the image of her, covered in dusty tomes. He told him about the time he mixed up the plans at a client meeting, and Claire teased him, calling him an architectural genius. They finished their wine, ordered tiramisu for two, and Thomas found himself not wanting the evening to end. As they left the restaurant, the rain had gotten heavier, pounding the pavement. Thomas opened his umbrella, but Claire waved it away, laughing. "Come on, this is Portland," she said, walking into the rain. "We'll get wet, so what?" "You're crazy," Thomas said, but he folded his umbrella and walked alongside her, feeling the drops running down his face. They walked through Nob Hill, past closed cafes and bookstores, their footsteps splashing through puddles. Claire told him about her college trip, when she accidentally fell asleep on the bus and woke up in another state, and Thomas couldn't stop laughing. "How did you even survive?" he asked, wiping his wet hair from his face. "I have a talent for adventure," she replied with a wink. "And you? What's the stupidest thing you've ever done?" "Well, one time He began, but stopped, looking at her. Her face was glistening from the rain, her eyes were shining, and he couldn't help himself. He stepped closer, took her hand, and pulled her gently toward him. Claire looked at him, her smile wavering, but she didn't pull away. Thomas leaned down and kissed her, tasting the rain and her warm lips. She responded, her hands on his shoulders, and for a second the world narrowed to the two of them, the sound of the rain and the light of the streetlights. When they pulled away, Claire whispered, her voice slightly shaky, "This is right." Thomas smiled, his heart beating like he had run a marathon. "Yes," he said, squeezing her hand. They laughed, soaking wet, and continued walking, holding hands. It was raining, but they didn't care. They were happy, and that was enough. Thomas Crow stood at the window of his apartment in Portland's Pearl neighborhood, looking out at the Willamette River shimmering under the city lights. It was a Friday in late June, and the warm evening smelled of lime blossoms wafting in from the street. In his pocket was a small velvet box containing a ring, a simple sapphire, chosen because Claire had once told him she liked the color blue. He had confessed his love to her in an Italian restaurant in the rain a year and a half ago, and their relationship had anchored his life ever since. Today he was going to propose, and his heart was pounding with excitement and confidence. Thomas put on a dark shirt and jeans, grabbed the box, and drove to Mount Tabor Park, where he and Claire often walked. He chose a lookout point at the top of a hill, their favorite spot, where the stars were brighter than in the city and the smell of pine trees created a quiet, easy-to-breathe silence. He arranged to meet Claire there at 9, making up an excuse. "Let's just take a walk, it'll be beautiful." She agreed, as always, with a slight smile in her voice that still made his heart skip a beat. By the time Thomas pulled into the park, night had fallen, the sky filled with stars, and the moon hung low, illuminating the path. He walked up to the platform where a wooden bench sat at the edge, overlooking the lights of Portland. The smell of the pine trees was thick, and the silence of the park was broken only by the distant barking of a dog. Thomas ran his hand over his pocket, checking the box, and felt the wave of nerves give way to calm. He knew this was the right move. Claire appeared 10 minutes later, her footsteps crunching on the gravel. She was wearing jeans, a white t-shirt, and a light jacket, her blonde hair falling loosely around her shoulders. She smiled when she saw him and hugged him, her arms warm. "Hello," she said, pulling away. "You're being mysterious today. What's the occasion?" "I just wanted to come here," Thomas replied, trying to sound casual. "It's a beautiful night. You can see the stars." "Yeah," Claire looked up at the sky, her eyes lighting up. "Look, there's the Big Dipper. I always look for that first." Thomas smiled, looking at her. They sat on a bench, and Claire began to tell about her student who wrote a poem about stars but forgot it in class, trying to improvise. Thomas laughed, but his thoughts were on the box in his pocket. He waited for the moment, feeling his heart pounding. "Why are you so quiet?" Claire asked, bumping her shoulder with him. "Usually you're already arguing that my students are geniuses." "I'm just thinking," he said, looking at the city below. "About us." Claire raised an eyebrow, her smile becoming curious. "About us?" she asked again. "Is this a serious conversation?" "Something like that," Thomas said, standing up. He took a deep breath, turned to her, and took her hands. "Claire, can I say something?" She nodded, her eyes serious but warm. "Of course, Tom. What is it?" He looked at her, her face illuminated by the moonlight, and the words he had been rehearsing for weeks flowed out. "You changed my life," he began, his voice firm but shaking with emotion. "When we met, I was broken. After the divorce, I didn't believe I could trust again, love, dream. But you, your kindness, your laughter, the way you make everything better, you became my home, and I want to spend the rest of my life with you." Claire froze, her eyes widening, and he saw them glistening with tears. Thomas dropped to one knee, took out the box, and opened it, revealing a sapphire ring shining in the moonlight. "Claire Hayes, will you marry me?" he asked, his voice quiet but full of confidence. Claire gasped, her hands covering her mouth as tears streamed down her cheeks. She nodded, at a loss for words. "Yes," she breathed, her voice shaking. "Yes, Tom, of course, yes." Thomas smiled, his heart pounding in his chest. He placed the ring on her finger, it fit perfectly, and Claire laughed through her tears as she looked at him. "It's beautiful," she said, her voice hoarse. You're unreal." He stood up, and she threw herself into his arms, her arms around his neck. They stood there, under the stars, in the quiet of the park, and Thomas felt everything fall into place. Claire pulled away, wiping away tears, and looked at the ring. "When did you plan this?" she asked, smiling. "You're always busy with your plans." "About 2 weeks ago," he admitted, grinning. "I almost got caught picking out a ring. Sam helped, but he's a talkative guy, so I was afraid he'd spill the beans." "Sam?" Claire laughed. "Now I know why he looked at me with that smirk yesterday. He knew." "Yeah," Thomas said, taking her hand. "But he kept his mouth shut, which is quite a feat for him." They sat back down on the bench, Claire still looking at the ring, her fingers intertwined with his. She rested her head on his shoulder, and they were silent, looking up at the stars. The scent of the pine trees surrounded them, and the city below glowed like a distant promise. "We'll be happy," Claire said quietly, her voice full of confidence. "Right, Tom?" He nodded, squeezing her hand, feeling it was true. "It's true," he replied, kissing her temple. They sat there for another hour, talking about the future, where the wedding would be, how many guests they would invite, how Sam would probably get drunk and dance. Thomas laughed at the thought and felt his love for Claire deep, conscious anchoring him. The next day, Thomas was checking his phone over coffee when he saw an Instagram notification. Avery, his ex-wife, had sent him a direct message. He hadn't seen her messages since he'd blocked her a year ago, but she must have found him through her new account. The message was short and snarky. "It looks like you like collecting rings. Congrats, Thomas." He'd learned that Claire had posted a story featuring the ring without mentioning his name, but Avery, who was still following their lives through mutual friends, put two and two together. Thomas looked at the message, his jaw clenching. He remembered her voice, her tears, her lie. "I married him for Hollywood." Her words had been an attempt to hurt, but they hadn't. He was free of her pain, of her world. He didn't respond, just deleted the message and blocked the account. Avery was the past, and Claire was his future. Thomas finished his coffee, looking at the city, and smiled. Claire was supposed to come. An hour later to discuss plans, and he was already imagining her laughter, her warm hands, their life together. He knew he had made the right choice, and that was all that mattered. Thomas Crow stood at the altar beneath the ancient oak trees in Laurelhurst Park, Portland, on a warm August day. His charcoal suit was slightly wrinkled from his nervous movements, but he smiled as he watched Claire Hayes walk toward him in a simple white dress with lace sleeves. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a loose braid, and she held a bouquet of wildflowers. The sun filtered through the leaves, turning the grass golden, and the scent of freshly cut grass mingled with the faint scent of her perfume. It was a small wedding, close friends and family, no more than 30 people, but to Thomas, it was the most important day of his life. Sam, his colleague and best man, winked at him, and Claire's mother, sitting in the front row, wiped away tears. "You look like you're ready to run," Sam whispered, straightening his tie. "Shut up," Thomas muttered, but his eyes never left Claire. She stopped in front of him, her blue-gray eyes shining, and they linked hands. The officiant began the ceremony, but Thomas barely heard the words. All he saw was Claire, her smile, her warmth. When it was time for the vows, he spoke, his voice shaking with emotion. "Claire, you gave me my faith in life again," he said. "You taught me to laugh, to dream, to be better. I promise to love you, to support you, to be with you every day, even when you order pizza with anchovies." The guests laughed. Claire rolled her eyes, but her tears were happy. She answered, her voice soft but firm. "Tom, you are my home. You make every day brighter. I promise to be with you, to laugh with you, even when you argue that your drawings are better than my essays." They put rings on each other, and when the officer pronounced them husband and wife, Thomas kissed Claire as Sam applauded and whistled. The evening was held outdoors, tables with white tablecloths, music playing on the speakers, dancing on the grass. Claire laughed as she danced with her father, and Thomas looked at her, feeling that everything he had been through, the divorce, the pain, the loneliness, had led him to this moment. A year later, in September 2028, their lives changed again. In a blue-walled room in a Portland hospital, Claire gave birth to a baby girl, Lydia, with blue eyes like her mother and dark hair like Thomas. Thomas held her in his arms, tiny and wrapped in a white blanket, and couldn't take his eyes off her. The smell of baby powder filled their new home in the Alameda neighborhood, small but cozy, with hardwood floors and windows overlooking the garden. Claire, tired but radiant, lay on the couch, looking at them. "She's like you," Claire said, her voice quiet, "already serious like you." "No, she's all you," Thomas replied, rocking Lydia. "Look at those eyes." Claire smiled, reaching for the mug of tea on the table. "We'll manage, right?" she asked, her tone half joking, but with a hint of concern. "Of course," Thomas said, sitting down next to him. "We're a team." Thomas learned to be a father, one step at a time. He changed diapers, fumbling with the fasteners while Claire laughed, showing him the right way. He read Lydia bedtime stories, The Caterpillar, and Where the Wild Things Are, imitating the characters' voices while she cooed at him. At night, when Lydia cried, he got up and rocked her, singing lullabies he didn't know while Claire slept. These moments, her tiny fingers squeezing his, her laughter as he made faces, were most precious to him. His cultural center project, completed in the spring, won an award from the American Institute of Architects. At the ceremony in downtown Portland, in a high-ceilinged auditorium, Thomas held the statuette, but his thoughts were at home with Claire and Lydia. He had cut back on his work hours, turning down new big projects to be with his family. Sam, his colleague, teased, "You're a dad now, not an architect," but Thomas only smiled. His priorities had changed, and he had no regrets. "Don't you miss the office?" Sam asked one day over beers at the Hopworks bar. "Sometimes," Thomas admitted, looking at the bottle. "But when Lydia smiles, I know it can't be compared to any blueprints." "Well, you're screwed," Sam chuckled, clinking glasses with him. "But it's cool, man. Claire and the baby, they're worth it." "Yeah," Thomas nodded, feeling warmth in his chest. "They are." Meanwhile, in Los Angeles, Avery Lynn was having another setback. She was sitting in a waiting room at a Burbank studio, leafing through an audition script, a 3-line part as a waitress in a sitcom. Her red dress was pressed, her makeup perfect, but her eyes were tired. She waited an hour until an assistant called her over. The director, a young guy in a baseball cap, looked at her without interest. "Start," he said, chewing gum. Avery read the lines with all her energy, but the director cut her off on the second line. "Thank you, we'll get in touch," he said, already leafing through the folder. Avery walked out, her heels clicking down the hallway. She got into her car, an old rented Honda, and slammed her hand on the steering wheel. Her Hollywood dreams were crumbling like a house of cards. She had made 3 cameos in 2 years in LA, but no one remembered her name. Her social media was filled with party photos, but the likes weren't bringing rolls. That evening, she returned to her tiny West Hollywood apartment, which smelled of neighbors' cigarettes. Her boyfriend, Mike, a tattooed musician with a perpetual promise of making it, was waiting for her on the couch with a beer. "How did it go?" he asked, without looking up from his phone. "That's awful," Avery muttered, dropping her bag. "More will get in touch. I'm tired, Mike." "Well, don't freak out," he said, shrugging. "Maybe it's not your thing. Work as a waitress until you get going." Avery looked at him, her eyes narrowing. "Not mine?" she asked, her voice sharp. "I didn't come here to carry trays." "Okay, relax." Mike stood up, rolling his eyes. "But I can't pay your rent forever either. I'm sick of it, Ave." They had their usual argument, and an hour later Mike had left, slamming the door. Avery was alone, with a glass of wine and an emptiness in her chest. She opened Instagram, where her feed was full of staged photos of herself at a bar, of herself at the beach, of herself with Mike, smiling. But now he is gone, like everyone else before him. She scrolled through and came across Sam's post, a photo from Thomas and Claire's wedding, laughing under the oak trees. Avery clutched her phone, her nails digging into her palm. She knew Thomas was happy, and that burned her more than her own failures. Avery finished her wine, her dreams of glory seeming further away than ever. She was lost, and somewhere deep down she knew she had chosen this path, rejecting everything that could be real. In Portland, at their Alameda home, Thomas sat in a rocking chair in the nursery, rocking Lydia in his arms. The room smelled of baby powder, and there were books and a teddy bear and a nightlight cast stars on the ceiling. Lydia was cooing, her blue eyes looking up at him, and he smiled, humming a lullaby. Claire was asleep on the living room couch, her blonde hair spread out over the pillow, and there was a half-drunk mug of tea on the table. Thomas looked at his daughter, his wife, their home, and felt that everything he had been through, Avery's lies, the pain of the divorce, the loneliness, had come at a price. He pulled Lydia close to his chest and whispered, "That's all I need." Avery Lynn stood at the bar at her cousin's wedding in suburban Los Angeles, clutching a glass of champagne. It was late fall, and the warm California evening was buzzing with the sounds of a party, guests laughing, dishes clanking, something from the 80s blaring from the speakers. The white tent on the lawn sparkled with fairy lights, the scent of jasmine mingled with cigarette smoke, and Avery, in a tight green dress, looked like a star. But her eyes, lined with black eyeliner, were empty. She had come to the wedding to take her mind off yet another failure, an audition for a commercial that ended with a standard, "We'll get in touch." Los Angeles, the city of her dreams, hadn't given her a chance in 3 years. She sipped her champagne, scanning the crowd. Her new boyfriend, Trevor, a bartender with ripped abs and a dragon tattoo, had promised to come over, but was already an hour late. Avery was used to it. The men in her life came and went like cameos. She scrolled through her phone, posting a story with a glass and the caption, "Feast of Love," but the likes didn't fill the void. Her life in LA was a series of parties, short-lived romances, and promises from agents who never called. Ave, Lauren, her sister, as voice pulled her out of her thoughts. Avery turned around. Lauren was standing there, wearing a simple blue dress, with her hair cut short and her eyes tired. She had flown in from Portland for the wedding, and Avery had been avoiding her all evening, knowing the conversation would be difficult. "Hey, Laure," Avery said, trying on a smile. "You look great. How are you?" "Fine," Lauren replied, her voice even but direct. "Work, life. What about you? How's LA?" "Cool," Avery lied, sipping champagne. "Filming, parties, everything according to plan. I can feel it. I'll get a roll soon. Lauren looked at her, her gaze heavy. Ave, stop, she said quietly. I can tell you're lying. You look lost. What's wrong with you? Avery squeezed her glass, her smile faltering. Lost? She asked, her voice sharp. Lauren, I'm living my dream. You just don't understand what it's like to want something big. Big. Lauren stepped closer, her voice hard but full of pain. Ave, you live in an illusion. You left Thomas, you cheated on him, you came here, and what? Are you happy? You broke yourself, and I can't watch it. Avery gasped, her eyes shining, but she clenched her teeth. I'm not broken, she hissed. I'm doing what I have to do, and I don't need your lectures, Lauren. Go save someone else. She turned and walked away, her heels sinking into the grass. Lauren called after her. Eve, I'm your sister. I want to help. But Avery didn't turn around. She walked outside the tent, where the party noise was quieter, and leaned against a tree, hiding her tears. Her fingers were shaking, and champagne had splashed on her dress, but she didn't notice. Lauren's words stung, not because they were lies, but because they were true. She was alone, her Hollywood dreams were crumbling, and men like Trevor were disappearing, leaving nothing but empty promises. Avery finished her glass, wiped her eyes, and returned to the bar, ordering more champagne. She didn't want to think about Lauren or Thomas or Portland. She wanted to forget, and Los Angeles, with its bright lights and party noise, was the perfect place to do it. That same day, in Portland, Thomas and Claire Crow were walking with Lydia in Laurelhurst Park. The green lawns were strewn with autumn leaves, the smell of wet grass mingled with the crisp air, and the laughter of children drifted from the playground. Lydia, a 2-year-old with Claire's blue eyes and dark curls, stomped along in pink boots, holding Thomas's hand. Claire pushed an empty stroller, her blonde hair pulled back into a ponytail, her face alight as she looked at her daughter. Look, Liddy, ducks, Claire said, pointing to the pond. Want to feed them? Oochie, Lydia exclaimed, clapping her hands. Thomas pulled out the bag of breadcrumbs Claire had insisted on and crouched down next to Lydia, helping her toss in the crumbs. The ducks swam over, quacking, and Lydia laughed, her voice ringing like a bell. She'll be an ornithologist, Thomas said, looking at Claire. Or she'll just like feeding everyone like you. Ha, that's true, Claire replied, sitting down on the grass. But I vote for the ornithologist. She's got talent already. They chatted, planning a trip to Italy next spring, a dream of Claire's that Thomas had decided to make come true. He wanted to show her Florence, Rome, the little villages with their cobblestone streets. Claire flipped through a guidebook on her phone, reading about the Tuscan vineyards. Listen, they write here that you can press your own wine, she said, her eyes lighting up. Can you imagine Lydia and me trampling grapes? Lydia will eat grapes, not trample them, Thomas chuckled. But I'm all for it. Just don't make me drink your wine. You're insulting me, Claire nudged him with her shoulder. I'll be a master winemaker. They laughed, Lydia pulling Thomas toward the swing, and he scooped her up, lifting her into the booster seat. Claire looked at them, her smile soft. Their life was simple, their jobs, their home, Lydia, but in those small things there was a happiness that Thomas had once thought impossible. That evening, while Lydia was sleeping, Thomas sat on the couch with his phone, scrolling through Instagram. Claire was making tea in the kitchen, humming some old Fleetwood Mac songs. He came across Avery's post. She was at a party in Los Angeles, wearing a sparkly dress, holding a drink. Her smile was bright, but her eyes were empty, as if she were playing a role. Thomas stared at the photo for a second, but he felt no anger, no pain, no pity, only peace. Avery was part of his past, and it no longer had power over him. The tea is ready, Claire called, putting the mugs on the table. What are you staring at there for? Nothing, Thomas replied, putting the phone away. I was just thinking how lucky I was. Claire smiled, sitting down next to him and laying her head on his shoulder. It's sappy, Crow, she said, but her voice was warm. But I agree. In Los Angeles, Avery returned to her apartment after the wedding, her dress wrinkled and her makeup smudged. She sat on her bed, scrolling through her phone. Trevor hadn't texted, and she knew he wouldn't. She opened Instagram, and her fingers paused on Sam's post, a photo of Thomas, Claire, and Lydia in the park, where Lydia was feeding the ducks. Thomas was smiling, holding his daughter, Claire was laughing, and their happiness was so palpable that Avery felt a pang in her chest. She felt her legs were shaking, tears were stinging her eyes, but she gritted her teeth. She didn't want to admit that Lauren was right, that her pride had ruined everything. She closed the app, threw the phone on the bed, and walked out onto the balcony, where the lights of Los Angeles glowed, cold and distant. Avery lit a cigarette, the smoke mixing with the night air, and she walked out into the night, looking for another party, another chance that would never come. Thomas Crow parked the car outside his new house in Portland's Alameda neighborhood and turned off the engine. It was spring, April, and the air smelled of cherry blossoms and freshly cut grass. The house, a single-story affair with white walls, wooden shutters, and the garden Claire had dreamed of gleamed in the morning sun. Lydia, their 3-year-old daughter, hopped out of the car in a yellow dress, her blue eyes sparkling as she ran toward the flower beds where only grass had grown. Claire followed, clutching a box of books, her blonde hair pulled back into a messy bun, her smile, as always, warming Thomas. "Lid high, don't trample the grass," Claire shouted, putting the box on the porch. "We haven't planted the roses yet." "Rosie!" cried Lydia, clapping her hands. "Daddy, when's Rosie?" Thomas laughed, picked her up, and spun her around. "Soon, baby," he said, kissing her forehead. "First, we need to unpack everything." "You promised the garden would be my project," Claire teased, opening the door. "Don't you dare blame it on me." "Me? Dump?" Thomas feigned indignation, putting Lydia down. "I already ordered the seedlings. Roses, just like you wanted. Red and white." Claire smiled, her eyes warming. "You're doing well, Crow," she said as she entered the house. Inside, it smelled of fresh paint and wood. The living room was piled high with boxes, Claire's books, Lydia's toys, Thomas's plans. The kitchen, with its large windows overlooking the garden, had already become their favorite place. Yesterday, they had sipped coffee while Lydia drew on the floor with crayons. Thomas and Claire had moved in a week ago, selling their old house to start a new chapter. This house had been their dream, spacious, with a garden where Lydia could play and Claire could plant flowers. Thomas placed the box of dishes on the kitchen table and looked at Claire, who was sorting through books. "Do you think we'll have time to make a garden before summer?" he asked, opening the box. "If you don't hang around the office forever," she replied, wiping the dust off her book. "When's your reward, by the way?" "Next week," Thomas said, smiling. "But I told Sam I don't want to make a speech. I'll just take the statue and go home." His community center, which opened a year ago, won another award, this time from the city's Association of Architects. At the ceremony in downtown Portland, in a room with picture windows, Thomas shook hands with colleagues, but his thoughts were at home. He cut back on his office hours, handing off smaller projects to Sam, so he could spend time with his family. Lydia taught him how to make sandcastles, and Claire taught him not to panic when her daughter got paint on her dress. "You're such a good dad," Sam said over beers at a Deschutes bar last week. "I remember when you lived in the office. Now, Easter cakes, diapers, that kind of thing." "And I don't regret it," Thomas replied, clinking glasses with him. "Claire and Liddy are my everything." "Well, you're lost," Sam chuckled. "But it's cool. Claire is gold, and Liddy is her copy." Thomas nodded, feeling a warmth in his chest. Claire was the heart of their family, her love, her laughter, her ability to find joy in the little things that held them together. She continued to teach literature at the high school, inspiring the students. Last week, her class had performed Hamlet, and one of the boys playing the prince had dedicated his performance to her, saying that she made him believe in the words. Claire laughed, but Thomas could see how proud she was. "Listen," Claire called, interrupting his thoughts. "Liddy wants to help with the boxes. Is that safe?" Thomas looked out into the living room where Lydia was dragging a box of toys, panting with the effort. "Hey, champion," he said, running up to her. "Let me help you, and you choose where to put the bear." "Mika is here." Lydia pointed to the shelf, and Thomas obediently put the teddy bear down. They spent the day sorting through their belongings, laughing at old photos Claire had found, and arguing over where to hang a landscape painting they had bought at a flea market. In the evening, when Lydia had fallen asleep in her new room, Thomas and Claire went out into the garden with mugs of tea. The spring air was cool, the stars were twinkling, and the garden, still just dirt and grass, waited for their ideas. "Are we going to start digging for the roses tomorrow?" Claire asked, clinging to him. "Yeah," Thomas replied, hugging her. "But you choose where to plant. I'll just swing the shovel." "It's a deal," she said, her voice warm. "This will be our garden, Tom, just like you wanted." He nodded, looking at her. Their life wasn't perfect. Lydia was cranky, work took its toll, boxes still sat unpacked, but there was happiness in those little things he'd once thought impossible. Avery's betrayal, her words, "I married him for Hollywood," were distant echoes that no longer hurt. They had brought him here, to Claire, to Lydia, to this house. Meanwhile, in Los Angeles, Avery Lynn sat at the Standard on the Sunset Strip, a martini in hand. The city lights flickered outside, the smell of cigarettes and perfume filled the air, and the music a techno remix drowned out the conversation. Her career had failed to materialize. She had appeared in 5 episodes of TV shows in 3 years, but no one knew her name. Her social media was filled with photos of her at clubs, on the beach, with a new boyfriend. But behind the scenes, there was emptiness. Her last relationship, with a photographer named Jake, had ended a week earlier when he said he was not ready to get serious. Avery didn't argue. She was used to such departures. She scrolled through her phone, her fingers stopping on a post Sam had made in Portland, a photo of Thomas, Claire, and Lydia in a park with the caption, "The Crow family is in business." Avery looked at their smiles, at Lydia running through the grass, and felt her throat tighten. She knew Thomas was happy, and it burned her, not with anger, but with the knowledge that she had chosen her path. Her pride, her dreams of glory, had kept her stuck in Los Angeles, in a series of temporary romances and empty promises. "Another martini," she said to the bartender, her voice tired. She finished her drink, stood up, and walked outside, where the lights of the Sunset Strip glowed cold and indifferent. Avery lit a cigarette, the smoke fading into the night, and she walked toward her apartment, where silence awaited her. She was stuck in a fantasy, and her loneliness was her choice. In Portland, the next day, Thomas, Claire, and Lydia were digging in the garden, preparing the soil for roses. Lydia, wearing a small hat, was carrying a shovel, throwing dirt around, and Claire was laughing, wiping the dirt off her cheeks. Thomas stuck the shovel into the dirt and looked at them, his wife, his daughter, his house. He remembered Avery, her lies, her leaving, and he realized that all of that was the price he had for what he had now. "Dad, dig," Lydia shouted, poking him with the shovel. "Already, champion," Thomas replied, smiling. Claire walked over, her hands on the ground, and kissed him on the cheek. "It will be a nice garden," she said, looking at the flower bed. "The best," he replied, hugging her. They continued digging, laughing, as the sun rose higher and their garden, their new life, began to grow. Thomas looked at his family and knew he had found balance between work, love, home. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think, click to the next one.